Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Great. In 2007, Heather Haaga endowed the Haaga Lecture in American Entrepreneurship at the Huntington in honor of her husband, Paul, a Huntington Trustee. It was a surprise birthday gift inspired by Paul's interest in the entrepreneurial spirit, and really fitting for someone with his own distinguished and successful career in finance, evaluating companies, and placing institutional bets on who was most likely to succeed. What does it take to launch successfully an idea, an organization, a company? What specifically in American culture and history has spawned entrepreneurial values and the willingness to take the risk necessary to develop something new? The dictionary defines an entrepreneur as someone who's motivated, passionate, innovative, but also the key is a willingness to take risk. Since the first Haaga Lecture in 2009, under the auspices of our research division, most recently directed by Steve Hindle, topics have varied and have largely examined entrepreneurship through a historical lens, focusing on the economic and cultural legacies of such figures as Alfred Sloan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Mellon, and J.P. Morgan. In this, the Huntington Centennial year, we celebrate our first century by continuing to preserve and interpret the past. But as we turn the corner into our second century, we particularly want to consider what it means to be both historic and contemporary, 100 years after our founding by one of the most visionary and successful entrepreneurs, Henry Huntington. So tonight for our Centennial program, we've invited none other than Paul Haaga himself to have a fireside chat with a woman who's had a remarkable and singular career in leading, growing, and turning around companies, someone who's taken many risks along the way in the corporate world and some in politics. And she happens to be a good friend of Paul's. But now I will leave it to our Director of Research, Steve Hindle, to introduce our guest and her interlocutor. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the program, and I'd like to publicly thank the Haagas for making this all possible. Thanks.
Hello, good evening, and welcome everybody. Delighted to see so many of you here for this evening's program. It's my great privilege to introduce our conversationalists for this evening. Paul Haaga Jr., as I'm sure you all know, is a retired business executive, active philanthropist, and apparently rugby football fan. Educated at Princeton, his bachelor's degree, and the University of Pennsylvania, his MBA and JD, Paul became a senior attorney for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and was a partner in the D.C. office of the law firm Deckert before joining the Capital Group in 1985, where he ultimately became CEO and director. After his retirement from the Capital Group, he was appointed acting CEO of National Public Radio. He has chaired the boards at LACMA and at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and was until recently a trustee of the Huntington, and is currently a charter trustee of Princeton University. He'll be joined this evening by Meg Whitman, who I am sure you equally all know is a business executive, political activist, philanthropist, and apparently soccer fan, or at least an investor in the MLS. Born in New York and educated at Princeton, her bachelor's degree, and Harvard, her MBA, she has held executive positions at Disney, DreamWorks, Procter & Gamble, and Hasbro, and has been president and CEO of both eBay and of Hewlett Packard. Since late 2018, she's been CEO of the video streaming platform Quibi. She is also one of the most notable philanthropists in the United States and is the national board chair of Teach for America. She ran for the governorship of the state of California in 2010. She's recently purchased a minor stake at FC Cincinnati and sits on the board of governors of the MLS. I haven't asked her which English Premiership team she supports, which is probably a good thing, since there is only one acceptable answer to that question. Paul and Meg have a great deal: Princeton, entrepreneurship, risk management, and philanthropy in common. To find out if and how they differ, let's hear them in conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Paul Haaga Jr. and Miss Meg Whitman.
Okay. I can take off my hat now. This is a Meg 2010 hat. And I tried to convince her tonight that I've worn it every day since I got it from being on her campaign. I'm not sure if she believed me. But thank you all for coming. Let's have a show of hands, honestly. How many of you are here solely to get away from televised football tonight? Any? Okay, well, thank you. That's very happy to be here. I know you're here to hear Meg, and the way I know you're here to hear Meg is that, 10 years ago when we started this, and we sent out the invitation. It said on the top, Paul Haaga Lecture on American Entrepreneurship, and one of my classmates from Princeton didn't read the rest of it. He just called me up and he said, are you lecturing or are you going to have a real speaker? And so Meg is our real speaker. She's also, Karen recounted our previous events and those who have been to them. We've always had, given the kind of the nature of being a library and everything, a museum, we've always had someone talking about a dead entrepreneur, usually a biographer or somebody. And so you're actually our first live entrepreneur. And I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you, but if you do well enough, we'll have your type here again. I am going to ask Meg some questions. I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end for the audience because I know you'll want to ask questions, and there are no mics out there, so you're going to have the question. And I requested it actually be a question. And secondly, if it's snarky, or if it's not, I'm going to repeat the question so everybody will hear them. So I'm going to ask the question you should have asked, if I don't like the one you did ask. Now, we have a finite amount of time, but I learned from reading about Quibi, and we'll get to that later, that Meg and her team pay $100,000 a minute for content. So I was inclined to talk really slowly for that. But anyway, I'm going to try to be done. We're going to try to be done by 8:30, 8:40. And then we'll have what the British tabloids would call a hard Megxit. And I apologize. You knew after this week that I was going to have to say Megxit somewhere in my thing. My research found, I did on Meg, found many parallels. I reread her book that she gave me in 2010, and it's really good, and I commend it. I had to pay $26 for it, but I noticed on Amazon it's $11 in paperback. So it's called The Power of Many, and honestly, it's really good, and a lot of the things you hear tonight. Governorship, yeah. And mine's signed, yeah. And it's not even signed to Paul, it just says Meg Whitman, so I could have sold it on eBay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I've not been to the Huntington before, so I'm super excited to be here, and I'm coming back during the day. So thank you for asking about my mom. You know, we all have people who made a big difference to us in terms of who we turned out to be. And in my case, it was certainly my mom. My dad as well, but my mom was a stay-at-home mom and, was just a big part of who I am. And interestingly, I have an older sister and an older brother. And my mother was part of the very first delegation that went to China after Nixon's ping pong delegation. You might recall Shirley MacLaine took a group of women to China right after it had opened up. And it was an all-female camera crew and then 12 women from all walks of life. There was, a sexologist from San Francisco. There was a 12-year-old girl. And my mother was the rock-ribbed Republican who could wear a peck-and-peck suit. And that's how she was cast. Anyway, the long and short of this, she came back having spent, 3 weeks with all these very capable 20-something women. And she looked at me and my sister and she said, "You can do anything you want." And amazingly, we believed her. And so she was, always encouraging us and basically said, don't be scared. Feel free to take risks. If you don't take risks, you won't realize what you can do in this world. And so she made a big difference to me. And the other story she used to tell us was during World War II, she wanted to be part of the war effort, but there weren't a lot of roles for women. So she joined the Red Cross in Boston. And the Red Cross said, she thought, I'll be safe, I'll roll bandages, this will be pretty easy. And the Red Cross said, this class of women, we need to go to the Pacific, we need you to go to New Guinea. And my mother was like, really? So she flew to San Francisco, got on a troop ship for 30 days. She said the best thing about being on the troop ship was she lost 30 pounds. Because she got seasick. Anyway, she shows up on this remote island and basically says, the base commander greets this whole troop ship full of women. There were 1,000 women on this ship, and said, "We need airplane mechanics and truck mechanics. Which of you women would like to volunteer?" And my mother, trust me, had never looked under the hood of anything. And she said, "But where's the need greatest?" And she raised her hand. 4 years later, a fully certified airplane mechanic and fully certified truck mechanic.
Great.
So she said, "Listen, if I can figure out how to be an airplane mechanic and truck mechanic, you can do just about anything."
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Meg, let's start off with eBay. And to set the stage, Meg was working at Hasbro. She had 2 young boys. Her husband, and it was in Boston, her husband was at Harvard Medical School, Griff, and she went out to talk to eBay. She ended up taking the job, relocating the family. Now at at Hasbro, she was running a division that was worth $600 million in income, and eBay at the time had 30 employees and $4 million in income. Revenue, not income, revenue. Meg took an 85% pay cut to go across the country. Meg is now being used as the poster child for not putting your salary history on your resume. But she moved the 2 little boys who were toy testers and were not that happy about being uprooted. Uprooted Griff. Griff found his way to Stanford and came to eBay. And your book's very interesting about why you did that, but I'd love to have you share what you were thinking.
Well, I got a call from a headhunter who said, "Hey, there's this internet company out in San Francisco that, basically sells items for auction on the internet." At the time, I didn't even know you could sell anything on the internet. This was 1998. And I said, "I'm not interested." My husband was actually he was at Harvard Medical School, but he was running the brain tumor center at Harvard's teaching hospital, the Mass General. My husband's a neurosurgeon. And so I said, "I'm not interested." To the headhunter's credit, he called me back 2 weeks later and said, "You are perfect for eBay, and eBay is perfect for you. I beg you to get on the plane to see the 26-year-old founder." And I was 42. And I knew I didn't want this job, but I didn't want to make the headhunter mad. So I said, "Okay, I will come out and see this guy, but I really want to see your next job that you have for me." So that night, it's 10 o'clock at night, we're living in Boston, and I say, I better go to the website, right? I can't go see this founder, and when he says, "What do you think about the website?" I go, "I don't know, I haven't been to the website." Yeah. So I went online to see what eBay was. It was called Auction Web, the fastest way to buy and sell online. And the homepage was in 3 sections. The first section was Pierre Omidyar, he was the founder, his fiance's homepage. She happened to run the Tufts Alumni Association in San Francisco, and it was the Tufts Alumni Association. The other third of the homepage was every link on the internet to the Ebola virus. Because Pierre was ahead of his time. He thought there would be an Ebola virus pandemic. And the middle third of the page was auction web. And, the URL was ebay.com, and the name of the company was Auction Web. So I'm sitting there at 10 o'clock at night going, can I get out of this? I am going to see a nutcase. Like, I was so mad at myself for not going earlier onto the website. So I fly out there the next morning, and the long story short, at the end of the day, I called my husband from San Francisco airport, and I said, "Hun, we should do this. We should move to California." Because what I saw was, that fit my mental model of great consumer tech businesses, which is, is there an emotional connection to the brand? And when Pierre told me people had met their best friends on eBay, I said, ooh, this is kind of interesting. There had been married couples. It was like the first dating site in some ways, because people connected over a shared area of interest. And then, is there real features and functionality that this brand delivers? And most brands have either emotional connection but no real features and functionality. Some have real features and functionality but no emotional connection. I saw both of those. And somehow I convinced my husband that we should uproot 2 children and his job at the Mass General to move to California into a 1-bedroom apartment across from Stanford Hospital, because I didn't know what was going to happen. And you're right, I took a huge pay cut. And so in this 1-bedroom apartment, the master bedroom closet was bigger than the bedroom. So it was one of those great things that you do as a family. But part of this was fate, and I'll just tell this one last story. So my husband goes, I know, here's what you do. You go out there, I'll stay here with the kids, you see how it goes, and then we'll come out after you. And I'm like, I don't think that's going to be workable here. This is not good. The boys were 8, 7, and 10. So I said, listen, you've got to get a job in California if this is going to work. So he, there's only 3,000 neurosurgeons in the whole country. So they all knew each other. So he calls Gary Steinberg, who's head of neurosurgery at Stanford, and the fellow who was head at UCSF. And I know how this went because I was listening. He goes, okay, so Gary, you don't have a job, do you? Because my wife wants to come to this no-name internet company, and I'm sure you don't have a job, do you? And in the craziest thing, he said, I'm opening a search for the head of the brain tumor program at Stanford, and you can have it if you want.
Wow. Isn't that fabulous?
So anyway, 2 kids, 2 new jobs, 2 new schools, and a 1-bedroom apartment at Oak Creek Apartments across from Stanford.
Great. Now, from that inauspicious beginning, you may not guess that Griff and Meg will be celebrating their 40th anniversary this June. And there have been occasions each of them has moved for each of the other many times.
I always get a little embarrassed when people talk about all these companies I've worked for. It sounds like I can't keep a job. But it's actually, he and I switched off for the last 40 years of sort of who took turns. And we used to joke, no sooner would one of us get traction at the company than the other one would have a different idea. Yeah. And so we moved back and forth across the country and moved for each other, which was part of the secret.
Well, it's worked. Well, this is going too well, so I'm going to ask you about the 1999 outage at eBay and just sort of what that meant to you and what you learned from it.
So for those of you who don't remember, eBay was a very fast-growing website. When I joined, we were growing at 70% compound monthly growth rate, which meant every month the company was 70% bigger than the month before. And I joined in January of 1998, and in June 10th at 5 p.m. Of 1999, the site went down. And this had happened before. This was not a new phenomenon. The only problem was 24 hours later, the site was still down. And so think about it. No one could buy, no one could sell. It'd be like if downtown Pasadena, every shop closed, and no one could buy and no one could sell. We had a CNN truck parked outside of eBay wanting an hourly update on what was happening. And I was not really a technologist. Honestly, Pierre Omidyar, the founder, was really the technologist. And so, and it was, the technology had been run by a fellow by the name of Mike Wilson, who was everything. He had built the technology. He had not documented the code. Okay, so any of you who ever run a technology company, make sure your senior technologist documents the code. And he was, I think this happened because he was on his first vacation in 3 years in Bonaire. And he was trying to fix the site by dial-up connection with Bonaire. So anyway, the long and short of it is I moved into the NOC, the Network Operations Center, and I stayed there for 3 weeks. I slept at eBay for 3 weeks. And I had my assistant bring in cots and sleeping bags and pillows, and we used conference rooms where the senior team who could help fix this. And I couldn't actually fix anything because I don't write code, but I could be there when I, called on our senior technology partners, whether it was Sun Microsystems or HP or others who had provided the equipment to run the site. So it was a super trial by fire, and learned a lot about just leadership by being there, and leadership by listening, and leadership by marshaling resources. And I said to Pierre, we were down for 23 hours, and at hour 22, I said to Pierre, what are we going to do if we can't bring this site up? And Pierre goes, don't worry, right about now, there'll be a DBA, a database administrator, who will come running in and tell us they have figured out what's going wrong and the site will be coming back up. And I looked at Pierre and yeah, right, okay, not happening. About 20 minutes later, a DBA came running in and saying, we figured out what's going wrong and the site is coming up. But it came up when you crash your car, it's not exactly the same for a while. That was a little bit about what happened. So it was one of those incredible moments of leadership, of trial by fire. And of course, the company couldn't do anything. The vast majority of the employees couldn't do anything. So what we decided to do was we had every single employee call customers. And so if you spoke Dutch, you called Amsterdam customers. If you spoke French, you called French customers. And it was one of those great cultural moments, touchstones for the company. And it was a great lesson learned for me about the importance of culture and the importance of humility.
Great, thank you. And you also waived all their fees.
Yes. We made a decision to waive, the user agreement said that we would waive fees for auctions that closed when the site was down. And we said we have so let down our customers here that we waived all fees. And for a company that had about $16 million of revenue at the time, the waiving of the fees was close to $7 million. But it was the right thing to do. And that's the other thing I've learned over time is always step back. When you're in a dilemma, step back and say, what's actually the right thing to do here? What's the right thing for customers? What's the right thing for the culture? What's the right thing to do? And it was fascinating because when we brought the site back up, every single customer came back. And we didn't lose a beat, but it was such a great lesson on, what's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I'm boasting now about my friend, but as I heard the story, Meg was walking past a conference room where people were debating what to do about that, poked her head in and said, what are you guys talking about? They told her, she said, do the right thing. And when she walked off, everybody knew what that was going to be.
And most people know what the right thing to do is if you give them permission to take the financial hit or whatever else it turns out to be.
And could you just, while we're on this subject of doing the right thing, tell us about Katrina?
Yes. Well, really, actually 9/11, yeah?
Yeah, yes.
9/11.
Sorry.
So 9/11 happened, and you all remember probably exactly where you were on 9/11 when those two planes hit the World Trade Center towers. And instantaneously, probably the companies or organizations that you work for, didn't you all, your whole organization, what could we do? And we, within 24 hours, launched a site, a companion site called Auction for America, where every eBay seller could put their item up for sale and donate 100% of the proceeds, or 75%, or 50%, or 25% of the proceeds to Auction for America, which was effectively the 9/11 fund and the Twin Towers fund. And you do things that you wonder how you actually do them. The whole company got into a zone. Under normal set of circumstances, to code the site to do that would have taken at least 30 to 60 days. The engineers coded it in 24 hours. It was sort of one of those amazing things. And in 60 days, we raised $100 million for the 9/11 fund and the Twin Towers fund.
And before we go on, there is also a Katrina story. You put $1,000 into the account of every New Orleans area.
Yes. So when there was this enormous hurricane, we had lots of sellers who were affected. And we had heard the stories of sellers and buyers who'd lost their homes, who, were really struggling. And so we said, you know what, we're just going to drop $1,000 into every user in the region of Katrina into their eBay account. And it was just like the delight and the relief of so many people of what for eBay at that time was not a giant number, but it was meaningful to those folks. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but on the very last page of Meg's book, it says the following sentence, and this is an exact quote: "I don't think there will ever be another eBay for me," which is a perfect transition to your next eBay, which is Quibi. And could you talk a little bit about it, the new venture, and I'll ask you some stuff about it.
Yeah, so the new venture has had our family move to LA. So we're living in West Hollywood, right on the border of West Hollywood and Beverly Hills, in the Sierra Towers. Do you know that 37-story building that I'm sure money changed hands to build that tower? But in any case, my partner, the founder of the company, is Jeffrey Katzenberg. Many of you probably know Jeffrey. And he and I were good friends at Disney back in the day. And then I went on his board at DreamWorks, and we kept in touch. And when he read that I was stepping down from HP, I told the board I would stay 5 years at HP, and I ended up staying 6.5. But I said, it's really time. And I said I was stepping down, and Jeffrey called me, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm the chairman of Teach for America. I think I might retire and sit back." And he goes, "No, what are you doing tonight for dinner?" And he flew up and pitched me a very early instantiation of of Quibi. And at the end of dinner, I said, this is a really good idea. And I think I have one more startup in me.
Good.
So it is very high quality, Hollywood quality content made for mobile in short form. So nothing on the app is longer than 10 minutes. We make movies, but they are movies delivered in 10-minute chapters. We have unscripted series that you don't have to watch, unscripted film that you do not have to watch in series. It could be documentaries or fun, lighter fare. And then daily essentials, where we are curating news, information, sports, talk shows to be consumed every day in this very short form content. So at first it was just the two of us. And we had the luxury of spending 6 months to write the business plan while we were raising our first round of financing. And so we closed our first round of financing in August of 2018, which was $1 billion. And then we started building the company. And today we have 228 employees. We just did a big sort of global reveal of Quibi at CES last week. You can go to Quibi.com and watch the CES talk. And we launch on April 6th. So we're super excited about it. I think this has the potential to be an enormous company, but we don't know. It's like every startup. You think you've got it done, you think you've organized everything and have the right, instinct around product market fit, but like all new ventures, you don't know. But we're super excited about it, and it's been great fun to build from scratch again. I did HP before, in between eBay and Quibi, and I have to say I'm much more a builder and an entrepreneur and figuring things out what to do than I am a big turnaround specialist. Although I will tell you, running HP made me a much better CEO.
I'm sure, and I remember now from one of the interviews I read getting ready for this, I enjoyed your quote where you said every business HP was in was on the wrong side of history. So welcome back to the right side.
Well, for those of you who are starting businesses or know this business, can I tell you what? You do not have to be a genius to know that you should be on the right side of trends. Yeah. And we're definitely on the right side of trends here in terms of, mobile penetration, video viewing on mobile, our target audience is millennials, what millennials want in terms of the storytelling and the length. And this is all mobile, and it's on-the-go viewing from 7 in the morning till 7 p.m. as you're commuting and waiting for a cup of coffee in Starbucks or waiting in a doctor's office or whatever. So, yeah, I think it's just great to be in a situation where you're riding the wave of a trend, which I did at eBay as well.
Yeah, great. Well, and all these people are my witnesses that NPR would love to talk to you about putting our news on your
Yeah, no, we'd be delighted to do,
on your daily essentials.
I mean, one of the things is we don't make any content ourselves. We commission content from content makers and creators. And in fact, the top 8 studios are all investors in Quibi.
And you have your sponsors are also going to be, you've sold out your advertising, or just about, at least a year?
Yeah, it's a advertising and subscription model. So it's $4.99 a month with ads, $7.99 a month without ads. And we think about 2/3 of the revenue will be the $4.99 with ads. And the good news is we have about $150 million of inventory in year 1, and we're 100% sold out with 10 major advertisers like Anheuser-Busch and P&G and Google and all those.
And borrowing from NPR, you're going to have, we have short sponsorship messages, you're going to have short advertising. You want to talk about the ads?
Yeah, so before each piece of content, which we call a Quibi, remember a Quibi is always shorter than 10 minutes, there'll be one non-skippable pre-roll ad for 15 seconds in front of that Quibi. Just one, not in a pod, and no interrupting of your content. And so we want it to be really focused for the advertisers and uncluttered for the advertisers and uncluttered for users. And the advertisers were super excited. 10 major brand advertisers agreed to spend $15 million with us each in the first year.
Terrific, terrific. Well, I'm sure there'll be more questions about it. And April 6th is the launch date. I'm actually signed up. I'm
Excellent.
actually,
Excellent.
I'm not on many.
So you went to Quibi.com and signed up to be a Quibi insider.
I'm not a user of any social media or anything, but I'm a Quibi
Thank
person. You'll be happy.
Yay, Paul.
You'll be happy to know. If you read Meg's book, and also if you know her, and if you follow her speeches and things like that, and there have been many wonderful ones, you will know that there are a number of Megisms, pithy and excellent quotes. And I've written a bunch down. In fact, I have several pages of them. I might do a dramatic reading later tonight, but I won't do them all now, and you'll hear some of them. But let me just throw out a couple, if I may, and then ask you to comment on it. Right people, right job, right time, and underline right time.
Yeah. So over my long career of managing and leading people and companies, Paul's exactly right. If you only do one thing, I have learned, it's do you have the right person in the right job at the right time? And since I wrote this book, I have added with the right attitude. And when you're growing a company like eBay from 4 million to 40 million to 400 million to 4 billion, you have to be sure you have the right person in the right job at the right time, because someone who was perfect for a company that was 4 million in revenues may well be outstripped by the time it's 40 or 400 or 4 billion. And so the key to the way I have managed organizations is, do I have exactly the right person in that job at that time? And I have learned this over and over and over again. For those of you who have ever needed to change out people in your organization, have you ever let that person go and then say, you know what? I wish I'd waited longer. No, you always say, why did I not move sooner? And so if your instincts are telling you you don't have the right person in the right job at the right time, it's just I've learned time and time again, it's better for them, better for the company to make that tough decision. And it is, I think it's the secret of just about everything.
Yeah, and the right people are?
Well, the right people are, do they have the skills to be in the job that they're in at the scale that organization has? Are they learning people? Are they getting better every single week, every single year? Are they scaling with the organization? Importantly, and I believe this now more than I did at eBay, are they a cultural fit? What HP taught me is, I used to think strategy was important, and it is, and the right people. But I also think the most important thing, in addition to the people, but they're related, is the culture. And in some ways, I think culture in the end may be the only thing that actually matters. And so the people have got to be emblematic of the culture that you want for that organization. And there's lots of different cultures that can succeed, but whatever the culture of your organization is, or importantly, whatever you want it to be, you've got to have people that embody that culture. And I learned at eBay that no one is indispensable. That actually it really matters who those people are and their values and how they treat other people and think about customers.
Yeah. And Meg, one of the things I liked when you talked about culture and you called it DNA in some cases, that there is a DNA, even when you go to an established 50-year-old company, it has a DNA, and I think one of you said it's much easier to double down on existing DNA than to change the old DNA, and so you take the best part of the founder's DNA. And one of the Megisms is actually a quote from, I think, Michael Eisner. It all began with a mouse.
Right. I learned that from Michael. The culture of Disney, in humility, is it all began with a mouse. And I'm a big believer that, listen, when I came to HP, which was 80 years after the founding of HP was founded in 1939. In a little known fact, the very first product that HP sold was to the Walt Disney Company, the 200B audio oscillator that made the fantastic sound in Fantasia.
Wow.
And Disney bought 8 of those from Hewlett Packard. Those were the first 8 sales that Hewlett Packard ever made, and launched Silicon Valley that we know today. But it was interesting, 80 years later, I could still see the founder DNA in HP. Commitment to customers, commitment to doing good in the community, and innovation. There were a lot of problems that had happened to that company, and when I came, I said, let's double down on the things that this company is known for, that's in the core DNA, and it was much easier to get those things going than try to train the organization to do something that was never in the founder DNA. So back to entrepreneurship, honestly, the founder and CEO DNA absolutely gets imprinted on these companies very early. And you have to be thoughtful about that. You have to say, and one of the things we did at Quibi is, what is the mission and what is the values? And we did it very early. I think there were only 20 people in the company, and we took the top 6 or 8 people off-site for 2 days and laid out the mission and the values. And we have hired to those values, we have fired to those values. And I said to Jeffrey, if we're not careful and we don't lay this out, the culture of the company will define itself. And we have to get a hold of this and make sure that it is the kind of company that we want to run.
And one of the ways you did that was an early decision that I think was yours solely about the issue at Quibi of mining and monetizing data.
Yes. Yeah. So today, as you know, privacy, data security, data privacy is the issue perhaps of our time right now. There's many others, but that's a very important one. And you can imagine that every advertiser wanted every bit of data about every individual user. In fact, advertisers today ask you for something called device ID, meaning they know that that device is connected to Paul Haaga. And we made a decision early on. We said, you know what? We're not doing that. By the way, if we had made the decision the other way, we would have been on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
And we said, we cannot do this. So you should try staring down Procter & Gamble and saying, we're not giving it to you. Procter was so important to us as an anchor advertiser because what Procter does, everyone else thinks is a great idea. And they walked. Yeah. And we said, we cannot bend on this issue. We cannot give you device ID. And ultimately, they came back around. But I remember looking at Jeffrey and said, I think we just blew up Procter & Gamble. Yeah. And but
where you used to work.
Where I used to work. I'm on the board of directors. And but I just felt it was the right thing to do. Yeah. And one of the values of the company is the hard right versus the easy wrong. Right. And the easy wrong would have been to give them device ID. And the hard right was to not. And so it's actually been a pretty good guiding light for us as we've made decisions about this very young company.
Great. Meg, one of your characteristics and something you talk about a lot and that I've observed is courage. Yes. And there was an incident where you were early on at eBay were asked to give a projection about earnings growth.
Yeah.
Could you, and Mary Meeker, who we both know, was at the analyst meeting and was watching you, and if you could tell that story, I think that.
So I was a young CEO. I was 42 when I went to eBay, and I think it was my second or third, maybe my second analyst meeting, which is a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal today, let alone being a 42-year-old, green CEO. And one of the things that we needed to do, I thought, was explain to our analysts how big an opportunity we thought eBay was. So we spent, a couple of weeks really thinking about how big we thought this company could be. And just for perspective, it was about a $40 million company at the time. And so we announced at our analyst meeting that we thought in a couple of years we could be a $3 billion revenue company. When I announced this at the analyst meeting, you could have heard the gasp in the room. And after the analyst meeting was over, I got an email from Mary who said, "That was irresponsible. What are you thinking? You have just set yourself up. If you do not meet that number, you're going to be toast with all these analysts. Like, what were you thinking? Why didn't you call me?" This was Mary Meeker, who was, then known as the queen of the internet. And I remember thinking, oh dear, I might have made a pretty big mistake here. But I thought it was important to lay out the magnitude of the opportunity here. And it was very galvanizing for the company because we then took that $3 billion revenue target and divided it up among categories, US and international. And the long and short of it is we got to $5 billion.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you just have to have courage, and everyone will tell you you're nuts. And sometimes you just have to say, I hear you, I understand, but it seems like it's, the correct thing to do. And I would do it again. Now, it worked out really well. If it hadn't worked out, I might not be sitting here.
Right.
But anyway, you just have to have courage. Listen, it took a lot of courage to, go to eBay. I mean, my husband was running the brain tumor program at Harvard's teaching hospital, the MGH. You know that acronym MGH, which is the Mass General Hospital? In neurosurgery circles, they call it man's greatest hospital. And, let's throw up all the cards in the air and see how they come down. But the other thing we learned along the way is, and I think this is part of courage, is what's the worst thing that can happen? Like, what is literally the worst thing that can happen, and how bad is it? And can you recover from it? And we looked at each other and we said, what's the worst thing that can happen? And we figured, I don't know, we'd both go get another job. Yeah. And so, sometimes you just have to sort of anchor yourself in really how bad could it possibly be.
Great, thank you.
Now you should ask me why I ran for governor, but that's a whole other story.
I did ask you if anything's off limits. These people might ask, but I will get you to talk about that. But first, when you Google Meg, you find lots of really good stuff. One of them is a 2017 graduation speech, and you told the graduating class three things. It was three things that worried you. One was there's an attack on truth, and you said if we don't share a common reality, we can't reason together. You talked about an attack on free speech, and quoted John Stuart Mill, who said one of the first Megisms, he who knows only his own side of the case knows very little of that. And then you talked about incivility, and talked about how, told him to, and it was just Carnegie Mellon, by the way, learn to listen to understand, not just to prepare to respond. And then you concluded, the country needs more than your skills, it needs your ideals. Now, we're not out of the attack on truth, attack on free speech. Even though it was a wonderful speech, it didn't solve the problem. You had this in eBay where you had to face some questions about what ought to be censored or kicked off the thing. I'm sure you're going to face it at Quibi, and you will have stuff coming from other people, so you'll be one step removed. But as we've learned from the attacks on Facebook, one step removed isn't enough. So if you want to talk about just
Sure.
thoughts about free speech and censorship.
Sure. So, listen, I'm a big believer in free speech. I think all of us, we understand that was one of the founding values of this country. But sometimes, again, you have to make a judgment call. And so I'll tell you the situation we faced at eBay. And I think it's quite relevant to what some of the big social networks are facing today. So Pierre Omidyar, as I said, the founder of eBay, was a libertarian. And his view was, if the item is legal for sale in the country in which you are doing business, then it should be legal for sale on eBay in that country. And so, you know, what we started to see in the United States was a dramatic increase in Nazi memorabilia. Now, Nazi memorabilia, as it turns out, is legal for sale in the United States. It's not legal for sale in France, it's not legal for sale in many countries in Europe, but it is legal for sale here. And we had a very interesting dilemma because Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, was on our board, and he had just come back from Auschwitz. And he called me and he said, we have to get rid of this off the site. We just cannot be, you know, purveying Nazi memorabilia. And so he said, the board meeting was the next day, and he said, I want to talk about this at the board. And it was a fascinating debate because Jeff Skoll, who also happens to be Jewish, was arguing the opposite. He was arguing the libertarian slippery slope. And ultimately, at the end, the board was, interestingly, came down 50% on one side and 50% on the other. Wow. And at the end of the board meeting, they looked at me and goes, okay, Meg, you decide. And in the end, I said, you know what? I think, and Howard said this to me, he said, Meg, it's about the character of the company. What do you want this company to stand for? And it's not just a cute little internet company anymore. It is a 15,000 people, $8 billion company. And in the end, I said, we're not going to continue the sale of Nazi memorabilia on eBay. But there were second-order questions. Okay, do you allow the sale of Mein Kampf? Do you want to be in the book banning business? And we decided we did not want to be in the book banning business, but we would ban Nazi memorabilia. Here was another one. Some of the Nazi memorabilia that was being sold was from World War II American veterans who had collected helmets, things from German soldiers, and they were selling them to support their retirement. What do you do about that? Yeah. So in the end, we made a fairly blanket statement. But then the next issue was alcohol, firearms, and tobacco. Perfectly legal to sell guns on eBay back in the day and on the internet today. And we decided we didn't want to be in the business of alcohol, tobacco, or firearms because you don't actually know who's really buying them. And I have to say one of the sort of most relieved days in my entire life was we decided not to sell guns on eBay about 30 days before Columbine. When Columbine hit, there was 24 hours where we thought the guns had been bought on eBay. Can you imagine? It turned out they were not, but I knew we'd made the right decision. And so we began a process of deciding what was legal, what was okay for eBay, for the character of the company. And I would argue I understand free speech. I understand that Nazi memorabilia is legal for sale. I understand that firearms is legal for sale. But at some point, I think you have to decide what you stand for. And so when you think about the decisions that a lot of these social networking companies are making, I think at some point you have to say, but what is in the best interest of the country? What is in the best interest of the character of our company? So it's just something that, you know, thank you to Howard Schultz and others on the board who, that one question, what do you want the character of the company to be, was such a guiding light for us, and still is, by the way. And on Quibi, the same thing. We curate all the content on Quibi, so nothing gets on Quibi that we don't say gets on Quibi, but we have to decide what to make. You know, where do you draw the line on what to make? And we've tried to be pretty...
And you're not the makers, you contract with the makers.
No, we commission it,
yeah,
but we decide to commission, and we decide to pay for it. So it's not, there's no user-generated content. So, but we have to decide. Let's say a great writer or producer or a set of Hollywood stars comes to us with a concept, and we're a little bit like, ooh, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
You know, youth suicide is a perfect example of that. You know, like do you want to be in that business or not? So anyway, we try to be judicious about it. It's a little tougher, in Hollywood and with content that is so popular today. But I think we've held the line on a couple occasions where Jeffrey and I have just looked at each other and said, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to do that. Someone else can make that movie. It will be made by someone else, but it's not going to be made by us.
Great, thank you. Meg, I wasn't going to ask you about running for governor, but I think you just asked yourself by bringing it up, so I will let you answer your question.
Yeah. So it's a very good question. It is courage. It is courage and maybe a little naivete as well, honestly. I'll tell you why I decided to do this. So I was not a big politico growing up. I mean, I was not president of my high school class. I was not student body president. But when I was at eBay, I got to know a lot of the senators in the United States because we were trying to, educate the challenges when you start a new company, when you're doing something completely entrepreneurial. In many ways, you are disrupting the status quo, and you actually have to help write new laws to govern things that have never had to be governed before. And so I got to know a lot of senators, and one of the senators I got to know was John McCain. And he decided to run for president, and he asked me to help him. And so I actually spent quite a bit of time on the McCain campaign, traveled around the country with him and got to know him very well. And I really admired John because he really was about country first. He really was. And so I was excited by that. And then my old boss at Bain & Company, my boss for the first 10 years I was at Bain was Mitt Romney. And I worked for Mitt for many years. And so when he decided to run, he asked me to help. And I really admired those two men because they were doing it for the greater good. They were doing it because they really felt like they could make a difference to the country. And so I was inspired. And you might recall in 2010, California had a budget deficit that was something like $475 billion. Right? The unfunded pension liability for our public employees was like $200 billion. The current account deficit was $100 billion. And education in this state, you probably know that we have, in 1956, we had the #1 public school system in America. Today, we are 48th out of 50 states here. And, the infrastructure, the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, I mean, just so many things. And I said, you know what, with my background, I might be able to help. So I jumped in. I did due diligence, but I don't think I quite understood exactly what this was going to be like. And in fact, I know I did not understand exactly what it's going to be like. And I will tell you, it was the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire career. I mean, brutally difficult. And it's because I think it is, for those of you who've never run, which is probably just about everyone, politics today in America is a full-on combat sport, okay? It is, you have to be wired for combat. And I am actually not wired for combat. I was not a debater in high school or college. I am not I'm not a lawyer that does litigation. And I think it's very hard if you are not wired for combat because everything is, I say red, they say green. Watch the morning shows, watch the weekend morning shows, and no matter what the person says, the host says the opposite. Yeah. Just because they're trying to elicit. And I found that to be really, really, really difficult. And the other thing I found is that just like you grew up in your business at Capital, I grew up at Procter & Gamble and Bain & Company and the Walt Disney Company. Politicians today, for the most part, are career politicians. Not all of them, not our president, but many are. And there's things that you just don't know. Yeah. And I kept stepping in it because I didn't actually know. And I'll give you a perfect example. So I was on the border between Mexico and California, understanding immigration and what the challenges were on the border. And at the end, I did a little press avail. And I'd been running for about 3 or 4 months. And the reporter said to me, Meg, what are you going to do about the 11 million immigrants in this country who are here illegally? And I said, well, I don't think we're going to deport 11 million people, and I think what we need to do is find a path to legalization. I did not say citizenship. I said legalization. This is in the Republican primary. The reporter's eyes got big. They were like, oh, we got a live one here. Yeah. We got a live one. Yeah. And I thought, okay, well, that seemed kind of a reasonable thing to say. And I get back in the car, and my campaign team goes, do you not know the answer to that question in a Republican primary? I said, no, I don't know the answer to that. They said, well, why did you say that? I said, because it's what I thought. And they go, the answer in a Republican primary is, until we secure the border of the United States of America, we cannot decide what to do with the 11.5 million people who are here illegally. And I said, but what if they ask me again, Meg, what are you going to do about the 11.5 million people who are here illegally? Until we secure the border of the United States of America, we cannot decide what to do with the 11.5 million people who are here illegally. And I'm like, oh my God, that's like what this is. Yeah. And there was 20 of those things. And I think I answered almost all of them.
Wow.
What I thought, but was not necessarily right for a Republican primary.
Good
and
for
after
you.
I said that, by the way, you remember in the Republican primary I ran against this guy named Steve Poizner. You might not remember that. Yeah. But anyway, I was up like 50 points to his 10. I said that, the lead collapsed to 4 percentage points.
Wow.
The campaign was right. The campaign was absolutely right. So when politicians don't actually answer the question, there's a reason why.
Yeah.
There's a reason why. But I didn't know that. Yeah. And that was a problem.
Thank God. Thank God. By the way, she briefly mentioned in the McCain campaign, country first, her idea. She came up with that slogan that I wish more people used. Let's go to audience questions. I'm going to have a hard time seeing people. I wonder if you can just shout your question and then I'll try to repeat it. Yes.
Meg, it sounds like you have a great moral fabric, but it isn't going to continue with your company forever. How do you plan succession planning to carry that theme on?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Succession planning for moral.
Yeah, well, succession planning in general, and then for the moral compass of the company. So I might be, and I'm actually quite a humble person in many ways. I might be the best CEO in Silicon Valley on finding one successor. And it's not a very well-known skill in Silicon Valley. It's a better-known skill in more mature companies. But what I thought about at eBay was I didn't think I had my successor in-house. And 3 years, I always said I would stay 10 years at eBay. So I, 3 years before I wanted to step down, I recruited a couple people who I thought could be my successor. And I recruited them for values, for mission, for integrity. And then we got a chance to understand what their capabilities were. And my successor was John Donahoe, who was just named CEO of Nike. And John took eBay to places I never dreamed it could go, and it was such the right thing to do, but he had the same heart. And the same was true at HP. I was the 4th CEO in 4 years at HP. Can you imagine? I mean, the whole organization was so jaded. Like, I arrive on the scene, and they're like, okay, how long is this one going to last? So I stayed for 6.5 years, and then about 2 years before then, I started thinking about who could be my successor, and picked a guy named Antonio Neri, who had been at HP for 28 years. And that was such the right thing to do, because he understood the founder DNA, and I thought he would be the right, moral leader along with the board. So you have to think about it, and you have to plan ahead. And so when it's time for me to step down for Quibi, I'll just look and see who do we have that can help lead this company in the way that Jeffrey and I think it should be led.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Does your company have a strategy for directing advertising to consumers? Are you going to be, and if so, are you going to be using the behavior of the consumers to determine what advertising, and if so, what data will you be collecting?
Yeah. So we're going to do this on an anonymized basis. So the first thing is advertisers typically want to target males or females, particularly a company like Procter & Gamble, right? Pampers is 90% bought by women. So the first is, who's watching the show? Is it mostly women? Is it mostly men? What age group is it? We have a show by a woman named Rachel Hollis, who is the Tony Robbins for millennial moms. I don't know if you've ever heard of Rachel Hollis, but it's crazy. She packs 30,000 millennial moms into a stadium all across the country. But her target audience is millennial moms, right? So the first thing is, what's the demographics of the people who are watching the shows? The second is, what's the age of people who are watching our shows? How do they? So we'll first target by demographics. I think the question, so advertising is not that complicated. What is complicated to some degree is, so you're on Quibi and we want to make sure that we are recommending to you what Quibi shows you would like. Okay, so how do we do that? You know, we obviously watch your behavior of what you'd like to watch. We see how you watch it, but the question is, how personal do we get? In terms of, so we're going to walk our way into this. Because don't you just hate it when you've been shopping for like an airline flight, and then the next day you're on one of these big search engines, or you're reading an article, and like you're searching for a vacation in Antigua, and the next thing you know, like you're served all these ads for Antigua. It's a little creepy, right? It's a little creepy. You're like, I don't know about that. I've also had the experience when I am speaking about something and it shows up in my advertising the next day. You know, like they say that they're not listening on the phone. I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure. Yeah. So anyway, so we're going to try to customize for you, but not in a creepy way. Is sort of how we're gonna do this. So
that's another Megism, by the way.
Customize in not a creepy way.
Yeah.
Paul and Meg, thank you for this wonderful conversation tonight and leading up to tonight for all your years of principled, successful leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
My question's about your various career pivots. In addition to thinking what's the worst that can happen, are there other strategies that you utilize, or what is your thought process when you're deciding whether to go left or go right?
Yeah, very good question. And I've refined it over time. So a couple things. One is, what are the trends? So if I was giving advice to people today, what are the trends? And I said this earlier, like you really want to be in a business where wind is at your back. Honestly, it's just so much easier. And so, you know, choosing a business where the businesses are on the wrong side of history, you can do a turnaround as I did at HP, but it's really, really difficult. The second thing is, for consumer products, as I said before, is there an emotional connection to that product as well as a features and functionality? You know, features and functionality, my experience at Procter & Gamble is that is a features and functionality company. Whiter whites, fresher breath, cleaner teeth, you know, cleaner clothes. And they do it better than anyone else. There's often not a huge connection to that product, like an emotional connection. And so I would look for, if you're going to do a consumer product, what's the emotional connection plus the features and functionality? And if you can find both, 1 + 1 usually equals 5. So I think that's an important one. The second one is what is the white space? Okay, so for example, in Quibi, we basically said, listen, there's people who are watching a lot of video on your mobile phone. It's called YouTube. So what's the white space? The white space is this very high quality content in its short form. There's lots of people who are doing very long form, high quality content. There's a lot of folks that are doing short form, user generated content. The white space is the very high quality short form. And then you have to say, okay, so if there's a white space and we're successful, what is the sustainable competitive advantage? If we're successful, everyone and his cousin's going to come after us. And so what is it? How do we think we can build a moat around that business that allows us to continue to be successful? So those are the things that I really look for when I'm thinking about doing something different, or in a big company, starting a new business within a company. I try to think through that.
Thank you for the question, Shani. Princeton basketball star.
All right. Awesome.
Yes.
Hi, you mentioned that your mom was a great influence on you. What about your father?
He was too. I will say, what was interesting is my mother's generation, because my mother today would be 100 years old, and she was, even though she was a spitfire and a maverick, she was a very traditional stay-at-home mom. And my dad was a pretty traditional non-stay-at-home dad. I mean, he worked in New York City, we lived on Long Island, and he worked really hard. So he was there for us on the weekends, but not so much. He would usually come home by the time we were all in bed. And so he was a weekend dad. And I just adored him. But he was also a moral compass, and he was also quite, I'll tell you a little story. So, when you're about probably 13, 14 years old, everyone starts to smoke, behind the house, behind the garage, at the beach, And I went to him and I said, Daddy, everyone's starting to smoke. What should I do about this? And you will die. This is probably not great parenting, but it really worked. He said, well, I'm prepared to make a deal with you and your brother and sister that if you do not smoke until you're 21, I'll pay you $1,000. None of us ever smoked.
Yeah.
We were like $1,000 at 14 years old. We were like, this is the greatest thing that ever happened to us.
That's great.
So he was very practical in that way. My family was big campers. He took us camping. He took us fishing. He was a great dad, but he was not there every day after swim practice, after lacrosse practice, helping with the homework. It was just hard, right?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Great. Another question? Anybody? Oh, I'm sorry. Great. Shout it out.
Hey there. Thank you both. I'm a Princetonian, and thank you for representing us so well. I have a question especially for Ms. Whitman about being a Republican and also being now in a Hollywood sphere, where the two don't seem to mix that easily.
Yeah.
And how do you find that, your moral and political compass and the artistic idea?
Yeah, well, I have to say, gosh, and I don't necessarily want to get into a whole political thing here. The Republican Party that I knew has left me. And so I re-registered as it declined to state 3 years ago. It's not the Republican Party I grew up with. It's not the Republican Party that inspired me. And I think that makes it a little easier for me, honestly. And then, I have to say, you probably, maybe some of you don't know, I endorsed Hillary Clinton when she ran against Donald Trump. And doing that as a Republican, you might remember when I did that. Oh my goodness gracious. You might as well have, set the world on fire.
Yeah.
It was just amazing to me. My longtime Republican friends and supporters, people went nuts, like nuts. And, but I just felt like that was the right thing to do. And so it's not a big issue. I don't talk about it a lot. And I am actually partnered with, the founder of Quibi is the single largest Democratic donor in the country and the single largest Democratic bundler. And so I just sort of follow him around on the political side.
Right. And for the record, I'm also a Republican. I'm the chairman of the board of NPR. So Democrats hang around with both of us. So, back and back.
You said you raised $1 million for giving the Trump. What would you recommend to someone who has the skill, or he thinks he has the skill, and the idea, but doesn't know anyone, bankers, venture capitalists to raise the money? What would you recommend to this person?
Yeah. So I guess I'd say a couple of things. First of all,
Meg, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, the question was,
repeat?
You raised $1 billion for your startup. What would you recommend to someone who doesn't know people, who maybe doesn't have a track record?
Yeah.
And how would you start a company? So I think it's really hard.
Yeah.
And I think what you have to do is you have to figure out how you can keep your day job and start your startup at the same time. And maybe the startup is nights and weekends, until you get a little bit of a product or something that you can go tell people about. And then I think if you've got to bootstrap it. You've got to see if you can't raise money from friends and family, just to get it started so that there's some kind of proof of concept. And then, you've got to start making the venture capital rounds. That's why there is a venture capital industry in LA. It's why San Francisco is the innovation capital of the world. It's because there's this unique relationship between the university, largely Stanford, the venture capital community, and then the companies that beget Silicon Valley. Hewlett Packard was the original Silicon Valley company. Practically everyone in the first 40 years after HP was founded started at HP. And then they left to go start all these other companies. And so this flywheel of anchor companies, venture capital and the university. So I think, yes, there's some great emerging venture capital community here. I think you got to go to San Francisco. And you got to start at the beginning of Sand Hill Road and work your way down.
Yeah.
If you're starting out without a track record, you want to try to raise, a couple $1 million. Jeffrey and I were able to do what we did because we've got a 40-year track record, and people trusted us to actually be, good stewards of the money.
And another megism, and you will fail, by the way, but another megism is that Silicon Valley was the home of all this innovation because it was the one place where failure was not a scarlet letter. You were not ostracized for having a failure. In fact, you were thought of as having had an experience that would be useful.
That is so true. I mean, that is the most amazing thing about Silicon Valley. Where else can failure be applauded? But honestly, when I hired people at eBay, if they'd had a failure, I was like, okay, come on board.
Yeah.
Because you've learned things.
Right.
And, it's really a remarkable community in that way, a remarkable community. And, it's courage, right?
Yeah.
It's courage, and courage is rewarded in a way that I've not seen almost anywhere else. It's extraordinary.
Despite my promise, I've let it run over. I'm sorry to cut it off. Meg will be able to stay maybe for a couple minutes as we walk out so you can come see her. I need to do another megism, though, as we go out, and this was actually not one of the ones uttered by Meg herself, but in the early days of eBay, a Saudi prince put, I think it was $150 million into eBay, and he sent a message saying that he would like to meet the CEO. And so, his people sent the message to Meg's people. So Meg said, well, ask what does he want to talk about? I'll be prepared to talk about technology or finance or, the customers or whatever. And the message came back, I just want to take the measure of the woman. So he came here, he met with Meg, he went home, another 100 million goes flying into eBay. So Meg, I think we've taken the measure of the woman tonight, and it really adds up. So thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Really, really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Meg. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your consistent support of our programs. Please join us outside north of the Rothenberg Hall for coffee and cookies. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you for coming.